A shivering girl sought shelter in a storm. Could a farmer's kindness save her life? Find out on Graceful Valor Stories. She was soaked, shaking, and silent. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from. He just opened the barn door and said, "You'll be safe here." She hadn't spoken a word all night until midnight, when the ground began to shake, and Marine One appeared above his field. Subscribe for more true-style stories like this, and let us know in the comments how it made you feel. The rain didn't just fall, it came down like a warning. Sheets of water slammed against the tin roof of Thomas Grady's barn. Each gust of wind bending the trees like they owed the sky something, the kind of storm that made even seasoned ranchers double-check their fences and stay close to their wood stoves. But Thomas wasn't most folks. At 73, the old farmer had seen his share of tempests overseas and at home. He stood by the kitchen window, one hand wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, the other resting on the windowsill. The house creaked softly in the wind. He liked that sound, it meant the place was still standing. Out past the porch, the gravel road that curved around his property was barely visible through the downpour, just a blur of gray between two lines of trembling pines. What secrets does this silent girl hide in the storm? Stay tuned on Graceful Valor Stories. That's when he saw her, a figure small, thin, walking alone in the rain. No coat, no umbrella, just soaked hair and a sweater clinging to her frame like it was the only thing she had left. Her steps were uneven, not panicked, but tired, like someone who'd been walking for far too long. Thomas set the mug down. No one walked that road after dark, not in this weather, not unless they had nowhere else to go. He pulled on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. The wind hit him sideways, pushing cold rain through the folds of his flannel. He squinted through the storm as he approached the gate. "Hey," he called out, his voice was calm, but firm. "You all right?" The girl froze. She turned slowly, her face was pale, soaked, eyes wide, not in fear, but something close to disbelief. She looked no older than 17, maybe 18, but her expression held something older, worn. Thomas raised the flashlight slightly so she could see him better. "I've got a barn," he said, voice low, steady, dry roof, wood stove, nothing fancy, but better than this. She hesitated, one step back, then two forward. Finally, she nodded. Thomas led the way, pulling open the side door of the barn with a groan of old hinges. The inside was warm compared to the storm, smelled of hay, pine, and thyme. He lit the propane lantern on the wall and pulled a wool blanket off the shelf, military surplus, heavy, and clean. He handed it to her gently. "Cantons by the bench, heater will kick in once the generator settles." She said nothing, just clutched the blanket and sat on the low cot he'd unfolded in the corner. Thomas didn't push, some folks coming out of the rain with more than water on their shoulders. He tipped his hat, gave her space, and stepped back into the storm. The storm dragged into the night, thunder rolled somewhere deep in the hills, slow and distant like boots moving through the dark. Inside the barn, the air was still warm, but heavy. The old propane heater hummed in the corner, pushing out just enough heat to dry her clothes, but not her silence. Thomas returned with a tin mug of soup and a folded towel. She hadn't moved much, still sitting on the cot, blanket wrapped around her like armor. Her eyes tracked him, but not with fear, it was more like calculation, like she'd learned not to trust too quickly. He set the mug on the wooden stool beside her. "Potato and corn," he said, wiping his hands on his coat. "It's not gourmet, but it'll warm your stomach." She glanced at it, but didn't reach. Thomas didn't press, he knew better than to ask the wrong questions too soon. Instead, he turned toward the generator panel near the tool shelf, gave the switch a small adjustment, and listened as the heater's rhythm steadied. When he turned back, she had the mug in her hands, not drinking, just holding it. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then shook her head, not in refusal, but in apology. "No name then," Thomas said with a nod. "All right, let's just go with guest." That earned the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but close. She glanced around the barn, her eyes moved quickly, not like someone taking in a new place, but someone cataloging exits, corners, angles. "You sleep with the door unlocked?" she asked softly. Thomas looked at her for a moment before replying. "Storm like this? Anyone mean harm wouldn't bother knocking." She gave a small nod, almost to herself. A few minutes passed before she spoke again. "That picture by the stairs," she said quietly, "the man with the dog tags, that you?" Thomas followed her gaze to the faded photo tacked to the post, a black and white image of him, decades younger, standing beside a shepherd and a pair of men in uniform. "Yeah," he said, "a long time ago." "You were Army 1st Airborne," she said, nothing, but her fingers tightened around the mug. Thomas pulled a second blanket from the trunk and draped it across the other end of the cot. She reached out slowly and began to fold the first one, not sloppily, not casually, each corner met perfectly, each edge lined. It was muscle memory. Thomas watched for a moment, then turned back to the lantern. "I'll be in the house if you need anything," he said. "If you hear coyotes, just bang the post once or twice." She looked up. "You always help strangers in the dark?" Thomas paused, hand on the door. "Not always," he said, "but tonight didn't feel like a night for questions." He stepped out, letting the door swing shut behind him. Inside the barn, the girl sat still, mug in hand, folded blanket beside her, and for the first time all night, she looked less like she was running. The rain eased just after midnight, leaving behind only mist and the sound of dripping leaves. The wind settled into a low whisper, brushing across the field like a sigh, too tired to keep fighting. Inside the barn, the heater crackled softly. The girl lay awake on the cot, eyes open, staring at the low beams above her. Her fingers moved slowly over the edges of the folded blanket beside her, not fidgeting, just feeling it. The wool was rough, clean, familiar. Why did Marine One appear at midnight, revealing her true identity? Discover more on Graceful Valor Stories. Outside, across the yard, a light clicked on in the farmhouse, then off, then on again. She sat up, slipped off the cot without a sound, barefoot. She padded toward the edge of the barn where a narrow side window overlooked the field. Her eyes scanned the trees, not fearfully, but deliberately. She crouched low, pressed a hand against the floor to steady herself. That posture didn't come from panic, it came from training. A moment later, the barn door creaked open gently. Thomas stood there holding a folded sweatshirt and a dry pair of socks. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, voice low. "You didn't," she replied. He handed her the clothes. She took them quietly. "You slept a little, storm's letting up." She nodded, then looked toward the window. "Still watching for something?" Thomas asked. The girl hesitated, then answered with a question of her own. "Your radio still work?" Thomas tilted his head. "Not much to hear this far out. I mostly use it when the power's gone. Weather reports, crop conditions. You ever pick up interference?" He studied her carefully. "Sometimes military stuff when the sky's right." She didn't react, but she didn't blink either. Thomas didn't ask further. Instead, he stepped inside and crossed to the small shelf near the wall. He pulled a dusty canteen down and handed it to her. "You talk like someone who's seen more than most girls your age." She took the canteen, unscrewed the lid, and drank slowly, then said, "And you talk like someone who knows not to ask too much." Thomas cracked a dry smile. "I wasn't always a farmer." Silence settled between them again, this time not heavy, just full. She looked down at the floor, then at the cot. "You served a long time ago. Does it ever go away?" Thomas glanced toward the window, toward the trees, and the night just beyond. "No," he said, "but it gets quieter." She nodded once, then almost as an afterthought added, "Thank you for not asking more than you had to." Thomas stepped back toward the door. "Truth is," he said, pausing in the doorway, "I figure if someone's running from something bad enough to walk through that kind of storm, they've earned a night's silence." He left the door open a few inches. Inside, she moved the cot closer to the wall, folded the blankets again at tight corners, flat seams, and lay down without turning her back to the door. She didn't sleep. She listened, not for danger, for engines. The wind picked up again just after midnight, but it wasn't the same wind. It came in short, pulsing waves that seemed to move the air itself, pushing dust across the field in rhythmic bursts. The trees didn't sway, they trembled. Thomas woke instantly, not from sound, from instinct. He sat up on the edge of his bed, pulling his coat on over his shoulders before his feet touched the floor. The glass in the window shook once, then twice. A low vibration buzzed in his chest, rising from the ground like the hum of distant thunder, but this wasn't thunder. He stepped out onto the porch. The sky above his barn was no longer black, it was glowing, a soft, unnatural white, like the moon had dropped into his pasture. Then came the sound, not sharp like a jet, but deep, thumping, as if the night itself had grown a heartbeat. Rotor blades, big ones. His boots hit the wet gravel as he crossed the yard, rain forgotten, and then he saw it, descending slowly above the far side of the barn, pushing wind and mist in violent circles, was a massive helicopter, dark green, 2 rotors, emblazoned with a barely visible seal that needed no introduction, Marine One. It hovered just above the field, its floodlights sweeping over the barn and trees like a quiet search for something sacred. Hay barrels rolled, the tall grass flattened outward in waves. Thomas stood still. He hadn't seen one of those since his time overseas, and even then only from a distance. He never thought he'd see one land on his land. The barn doors creaked open behind him. She stepped out slowly, wrapped in the same gray blanket, her eyes fixed on the helicopter like she'd been expecting it the whole time. 2 Marines emerged from the aircraft before it even touched ground. One stood beside the open bay, the other began walking toward them, boots crunching the wet gravel in perfect rhythm. Thomas didn't move, he just watched. The Marine stopped 6 feet from the girl. Rain plastered his uniform to his frame, but he didn't flinch. He brought his hand up slowly, precisely, and saluted her. She didn't hesitate, she returned the salute, sharp, perfect. Thomas felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The Marine stepped forward and spoke just loud enough to be heard over the rotors. "Ma'am, we've been tracking your beacon for 14 hours, orders were not to leave without you." She glanced at Thomas, then back at the Marine. "I wasn't lost," she said, "I just needed one night without running." The Marine nodded once, no argument, no question. Then he turned to Thomas. "Sir," he said, voice lower now, "thank you for keeping her safe." He reached into his coat and extended a sealed envelope. Thomas took it silently. The Marine stepped back. She looked up at Thomas one more time, the first real eye contact they'd shared since she arrived. She didn't smile, but she whispered, "You didn't ask, that's why I stayed." And then she was gone, up the ramp into the helicopter, swallowed by the light and the sound. Marine One rose slowly, then peeled off into the clouds like a ghost, reclaiming its own. Thomas stood there long after the wind died down, the envelope still unopened in his hand, the gravel beneath him muddy and still warm from the jet wash. He didn't speak, didn't move, he just looked up at the night sky and exhaled like a man who had just watched a secret walk out of his barn and into history. What did the envelope reveal about her mysterious past? Find out on Graceful Valor Stories. Thomas didn't open the envelope right away. He stood in the quiet for a long while after Marine One vanished over the tree line, the sound of its rotors still faint in his chest. The wind was gone now, even the rain had stopped, as if the storm had only existed to bring her to his barn and to carry her away. The barn light flickered once and went dark. He walked slowly back to the porch, the envelope pressed flat against his palm. It wasn't thick, one piece of paper, maybe 2, but it carried the weight of something unspoken, something not meant to be said out loud. Inside the house, he set the envelope on the kitchen table. He poured himself coffee, not because he wanted it, but because it gave his hands something to do. The silence of the house felt heavier than usual. He stood there for a minute, then sat down, pulled the envelope closer, and opened it with the edge of a butter knife. There were 2 letters inside, one official, one handwritten. He read the first: Department of Defense, Office of Civil Affairs, Mr. Grady, this letter is being issued in recognition of your unknowing aid and shelter provided to an individual under temporary military protection during an active federal security operation. Due to the classified nature of the individual's identity, details cannot be released publicly. However, know that your discretion and respect for privacy directly contributed to the safety and psychological well-being of someone who has given far more than most will ever know. On behalf of the United States Armed Forces and those whose names will never appear in the news, thank you, respectfully, La Hensley. Thomas set the letter down. He didn't move right away. He just looked at the second piece of paper, a smaller sheet folded twice, written in tidy handwriting. Thomas, you never asked who I was, you didn't call anyone, you didn't demand answers, you just opened your barn and made sure the heater worked. I've spent the last 3 years in places where everything is a transaction, where every face is a mask, where every kindness is followed by a question. You gave me silence and safety and space, and that for someone like me is rarer than anything the government could have offered. I needed one night where I wasn't someone's asset or liability or daughter or burden. I just needed to be a girl, and you let me. I won't forget it. You don't know me, but I will remember your name." Thomas leaned back in the chair. He stared at the note, then at the window. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the sky was starting to lighten just slightly at the edges. He didn't smile, but he did something close. He folded both letters with care, slid them into the same envelope, and walked to the far end of the living room. In the corner was a small box, old wooden, the kind you didn't throw out because it held more than just things. Inside were medals, dog tags, a photo of his old unit, and a folded flag that hadn't been touched in years. He placed the envelope beneath the flag, then he closed the lid. He didn't need to tell anyone what happened, didn't need to prove he mattered that night. She already had. Dawn came slow, like it wasn't quite sure it was welcome. The clouds had thinned, leaving streaks of pale orange along the horizon. The field shimmered faintly with morning mist. The barn, still damp from the storm, stood quietly beneath a sky that now looked harmless. As if the night before had been a dream too big for this small patch of land, Thomas stood on the porch, a chipped mug in hand. Not coffee this time, just hot water and a slice of lemon. His doctor had been after him about caffeine, he hadn't listened much, but this morning it felt right. Across the yard, the gravel road was empty, no sign of Marine One, no black SUVs, no boots in the mud, just the faint imprint of tire tracks cutting through the grass. He sipped slowly, eyes settling on the barn. The door was still slightly ajar, he'd meant to close it earlier, but hadn't. He figured it would creak itself shut eventually, but now, standing there in the morning calm, he decided to walk over instead. Inside, the cot was still there, the blanket folded once more, corners sharp, edges flat. On the wall above the workbench, something had been pinned with a nail that wasn't dramatic, just quiet, a dog tag, not his and not from his war. She'd left it behind, a small flat piece of metal, numbers etched in a code he didn't understand, but it wasn't for him to understand, that wasn't the point. He reached up and touched it gently, just once, then left it where it was. Back in the house, he sat at the table again and reopened the second letter. He didn't read it, not this time. He just unfolded it and placed it beside his old army photo. There was something comforting about seeing them together, past and present, side by side, connected not by battlefields, but by silence and shelter. Later that morning, a neighbor stopped by. Old truck, loud engine, same one that always needed something. Morning, Tom, the man called as he stepped out. Heard a ruckus out this way last night, thought maybe a transformer blew or something. Thomas shook his head gently. Nah, just the storm. The neighbor nodded, unconvinced. But didn't pry you all right? Thomas glanced out at the barn one last time, then back to the porch. I am now. The man left after a few minutes, small talk, nothing worth remembering. But the words in that envelope and the silence in that barn, those would stay, not because he needed them, but because they were proof that sometimes doing the right thing quietly is louder than anything a man can say. The next morning came with more sun than expected. The storm was gone, completely now, as if it had only been passing through to deliver something and move on. And the field glistened under a thin layer of dew. Birds were back, cautious at first, then chatty. Even the barn looked newer in the light. Though Thomas hadn't touched a thing, he walked the length of the pasture fence with slow, steady steps, checking for storm damage out of habit more than necessity. The posts were solid, the gate held. Just past the south end near the old oak tree, he paused. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt, not his. They were smaller, lighter. Not military issued, but clean, intentional. She had walked this way before leaving. He followed the trail just a few yards where they stopped near the edge of the clearing. There at the base of the tree sat a small leather pouch sealed with a drawstring half tucked into the grass. Inside it a silver compass, its needle still twitching, and a single folded page torn from a field manual. No words, just a single phrase underlined in pencil. Always know where you are, even when you don't know who you are. Thomas held it for a moment, then looked up at the sky. Blue now, quiet, familiar. He brought the pouch back to the barn and placed it next to the folded blanket on the cot. He didn't lock the door behind him. Back at the house, he cleared a space on the mantel between the flag case and the frame holding his old unit photo. He didn't add a new picture, just the envelope and the tag. He didn't need a label to remember what happened. Some stories aren't told to be explained, they're kept to be carried. A few days later, he passed a young boy in town wearing an oversized Marine Corps hoodie. The kid held the door for him without saying a word, just a nod. Thomas nodded back. Somehow, he wasn't surprised. Some names are never spoken out loud, some stories are never printed, never shared, never verified, but they're remembered in the quiet way that matters, by a folded blanket, by a dog tag hung on a nail, by a farmer who asked for nothing and gave more than he knew. He didn't get medals, didn't make the news, didn't even know who she was, but she knew who he was, and that was enough. If this story moved you, if you believe kindness still matters and that quiet heroes walk among us unnoticed but never unworthy, then this channel is for you. To comment below with what you felt, and if you know someone like Thomas Grady, someone who helps without needing a reason, tell them their story matters, too, and subscribe, not for us, but so more people hear stories like this before they're forgotten. Because sometimes a barn is just a barn, and sometimes it's where someone's life turned quietly back toward the light. On Graceful Valor Stories.